All right, let's continue our discussion of God. So, if I remember correctly, in the last video, we talked about the ultimate explanation, about the fact that it can't be different from what it is, and hence there can only be one of them, and um, and the fact that because it cannot be different from what it is, the only way to make sense of it is to say that the essence that it has is actually existence. So it cannot have an essence different from existence, because otherwise it could have been different from what it is. It wouldn't be pure act. So we defined that as God. We said that God is the act of being, the ultimate explanation, and that basically concludes the first part of the argument. So if you remember, we said that the arguments will be generally in two parts. The first part, we come to an idea about some necessary being, one necessary being in this case, pure act. And in the second part, we will start getting to know more about it, trying to get some information about this thing. Now, the way that usually people do, if you read some theological books on this, after they arrive, for example, at this point, to continue to do philosophy on these specific information that they gain, for example, the fact that it's pure act. And then they will try to get information out of that. Now, of course, I will be using some of the information that I used in the first part, but the main way of arguing for getting information about this God will be again through observation of things that exist. I will explain in a second what I mean by that. But let me just first make it clear that, again, what we mean by God. What we mean is not a thing, is not a being in a sense that's something that has existence, some essence that has existence, something that exists. God does not exist in that sense. Rather, God is the act of existing. Now, we might think that we know what existence means, or what esse, as they used to call it, what esse means, but we have to be careful that the existence that we are familiar with is always the existence in a specific essence, in a specific form. So we know what it means for a glass to exist, or for a dog to not exist in my room. So I can get a sense of what existence is. I can see the difference between something that exists and something that doesn't exist. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I can grasp the concept of existence itself, because there might be a difference that because of existing within this specific format as a dog, that obviously might change the way that we receive existence. So that's just a quick point about this, that why is it that we are looking at, because someone might say, okay, existence is pretty obvious, like, okay, existence, but we can actually gain a lot of information about it if we look more into creatures. All right, so the way that I will be trying to get information about this act of being is by noticing that even though, as I just mentioned, the existence of things is different in general, I mean, we can't say that it's exactly the same thing, even though it's different from the existence of God, not the existence of God, but from God, the existence, the act of being itself. But it's not completely different. There are analogous to each other. They're both existence, but they're not exactly the same, but at least in general, we cannot claim such a thing. So my hope is that if existence has something that we can learn about it, and if things exist, which means that they are essences somehow participating in the existence, in the act of being, then we should be able to see some of that information in the existence itself. So if we look around and look at things, and if we see something that is similar in all of them, in a sense that if we see something that is independent of essence of a thing, then that can be a good candidate for assigning that thing to existence, right? Because everything that exists is participating in existence. So if existence has something, for example, let's say existence has the color blue, or is blue, for example, then everything that exists, by the fact that it's participating in that blue, should have some trace of that blueness in it, right? So if we look around and we basically factor the essences, the differences in the essences, then we should get to something that is a good candidate for assigning to the act of being itself. There are two more points that I have to mention about this. First, I keep saying it's a candidate. It's not exactly the same thing. We don't always can assign this to the existence. And why is that? Because among the creatures, there are similarities. There are things that we cannot, that even though it's similar and it's the same for all of them, we cannot assign to God, to existence. For example, the fact that they can be different from what they are. Now, everything in existence beside God can be different from what it is, regardless of their essences, right? But that doesn't mean that we can factor this out. We say, okay, this is a similarity, therefore God can be different from what it is. No, it can't. We can't say that everything has an essence different from its existence, therefore God should be like that. But that's not the case. Everything is limited, therefore God is limited, and that's not the case. So we see that even though we can look at these things and they have a similarity, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can apply this and we can basically push this attribute up to the world of God. If everything, for example, moves, does that mean that God moves? No, because God can be different from what it is. It's pure act. But if there are anything, this should be this is not a sufficient condition, but it's a necessary condition for something to be pushed as an attribute to the divine world. So that's one point, that we should be careful about this. And I always forget my second points. I guess the second point that I wanted to make is that when we get an attribute, we say, okay, this thing is similar to all of them, is found among all creatures. We cannot say that God has that attribute. Yes, now I remember, this was my second point. For example, if we get to something like knowledge, let's say, we should not say that God has knowledge, because as God is something pure act, is the act of being, God is simple in a sense that it cannot have any kind of decomposition in any kind of sense, even metaphysical sense. That's why essence and existence are the same, because any decomposition would mean that it can be different from what it is. But God cannot be different from what it is. It's pure act. Therefore, we cannot have like God, and we cannot have the God's knowledge as something different from it, because we can only have one God, there's only one necessary being, and that thing has to be simple, because otherwise we can get to different problems, like whether God's knowledge is also separate as a necessary being from God itself, or maybe the God's knowledge can change. These things can all introduce potentialities in a God which does not have any potentiality. So we have to take these 2 points into account. First, we can only get candidates. That's only necessary condition. It's not sufficient. We have to check more before pushing it up. And the second point is that whatever we get, whatever attribute that we get, we cannot say that God has those attributes. We have to say God is those attributes. Or in other words, the active existence is those things, not that the active existence has those things. In the same sense that God does not have existence, rather God is the active existence. All right. Now with these 2 points, I shall start with one of the attributes as an example, just to show you how I drive usually the attributes, the divine attributes. Maybe I will do another session to do another one. I'm not going to go through every single one of the attributes that we can gain, but it's a very interesting game that you can play. Just trying to think about, I will give the general format. I will give a couple of examples, but that's it. We won't go through all of them, but you can do it on your own. All right, so the way that I would do it is first I define an attribute. I say what I mean by that word, for example. And then I look around and try to see if it satisfies a necessary condition for being pushed toward the divine world. That's, can I see it everywhere in creatures? Everywhere that I look, everything that exists must show it in some sense. And if it does have that, and if I can push it up, I mean, it doesn't have those, deficiencies that comes with the creature world. If it satisfies those things, then I will push it upward, and then I will say that existence is the same as that thing that we're talking about. All right, so let's just give an example. It will make everything more clear. The first attribute that we can investigate, let's say, the concept of power. All right, let's talk about power. So I'm going to prove that God is power. Now, the way that I'm going to do this is first define what I mean by power. Now, the argument for the existence of God started from the fact that we said that we call it the principle of sufficient reason. When something can be different from what it is, there must be some reason that actualizes that thing in that particular instant, rather than the other way. There must be an explanation to explain why is it that this thing is at this specific format when it could have been different by assumption. So that seems like a very good explanation. A very good definition of power. So I define power to be this ability to basically actualize something to be in one specific way rather than another way. So if something can be different from what it is, the ability that you can activate one specific form than the other form, that's what I call power. And I believe it's a very good definition, because if you think about it, like if I say that I have the power to hold up my glass, what does it mean? Well, it means that the glass had this possibility to be lifted, and I actualized that possibility. When I say that I have the power to speak, it means that, the world, the way that it is, it could have been different. It could have been in the same in the form that you could hear things, that the air could move in this specific way. And I have the ability to actualize, to make sure that the air is actually moving in that possible way. It had that possibility, and now I actualized it. So that means I have the power. When we say that someone has political power, we say, okay, society could have been in different ways, and some people have the power to activate one specific format than the other format. So that means they have power, right? So that's my definition of power. And then I'm claiming that everything in existence has power, and is not something coming from their limitation, from their creature nature, is basically coming from their existence. Now, why do I claim that everything in existence has power? So what I'm claiming is that if something exists, it has power. And the way that I show this is by assuming something that doesn't have any kind of power and showing that this thing does not exist. Because, for example, let's say we have something that doesn't have power in any way. Okay, imagine that. Imagine something that doesn't have power. Can we see this thing? No. Why not? Because to see something, it means that light has to shine on it. The particles have to reflect from the surface and come meet our eyes so we can see that thing. But if something does not have power, it cannot reflect particles. Because reflection basically means that this particle can move in a different direction. And if I actualize that direction, that means that I exerted power, I exerted power. I actualized something that was potential, It had the possibility to move in a different direction, and I activated that possibility. But if something doesn't have power, then it cannot do that. It cannot change the direction of the movement of the particles. Can we touch it? Again, no. Because that sensation that we can have, it's a possibility for us. But if we can touch that thing, that means that thing has activated this possibility of touch in our senses, which means it has power. But that's against our assumption that it doesn't have power. Can be detected in any sense? No. Because any kind of detection would be based on some effects. We would see something, and that effect is again a possibility that has been actuated and activated by that thing. And so basically, if something does not have any power, we can't see it, we can't sense it, we can't feel it, we can't measure it, we cannot detect it in any way. In other words, it doesn't have any kind of effect. There's no trace of it. There's no effect of it. There's no effect of it. There's nothing. Now, I believe that's a very good definition of something that does not exist. I mean, how can we distinguish between this thing and something that doesn't exist, right? If there is nothing, absolutely no effect, no actualization of anything, then we cannot detect it, then it really doesn't exist. So we see that if something does not have power, it does not exist. So everything that exists has power. And it is something that we can push actually upward, It's something that comes from the act of being. It's not from some sort of limitation. The limitation, the essence of things they shape the form of the power that they have. Like the power that I have as a human being depends on the essence that I have, on what I am. And the power of a car is different from me because car is different thing. But it seems that power itself comes from the fact that I exist and the car exists and the electron exists. So we can push this thing upward, which means that the act of being is the same thing as the act of exercising power, of actualizing. Now, the first time I remember when I was thinking about this, and the first time that I got to this conclusion, it was very interesting for me because, like, the act of power of actualizing things is much more sensible to us than existence. Because existence, okay, we know what it means, something to exist, but we really can sense it, you know what I mean? Like, but exercising power is a very tangible concept. And I remember the first time that I got to this conclusion, I said, oh, okay, the act of existence is the same as act of exercising power, or in the same way is just power. It made a lot of more sense to me, and it was very interesting for me to look at things again in a different light, because it basically again shows that even though I have something in front of me, like I have a camera in front of me and it looks fixed, it doesn't move, it's as if it's not doing anything, but it exists. And it's a little bit difficult to understand why is it that we can't say that existence is an act, like it's as if it's doing something. But when we realize that existence is actually power, it's the exercise of this actualizing things, then you start to see why the camera is not actually fixed or constant, is constantly doing things. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because like I'm constantly looking at the camera, which means that it's constantly being detected, which means that it's constantly exercising its power, it's constantly actualizing things. So existence becomes this kind of, I mean, in my mind at least, I'm not sure if it's happening for you too, but in my mind became this lively thing, it's just act, just keep going, just an action. So it's very suitable to call existence the act of being. It's an act, it's something that's constantly going on. And that the sense that I got from basically equating the existence, the act of existence, with the act of power. So in this sense, God is power. And that's why we call God omnipotent, in a sense that, not in the sense that God has power, that God has all the power that there can be. That basically God is power. God is what it means to have power. God is the definition of having power. So anything that participates, any essence that participates in God, which means that it exists, at the same time, because it's the same thing, participates in having power. So my camera is participating in God, exists, or in other words, it participates in power. It has power. It's constantly exercising its power, or in other words, is constantly in the act of existence. All right, so in that sense, God is power, right? That's one example, but you can see the template definition, see it in everything, make sure that it is not coming from the limitation, that we can actually push it toward God, push it there, and then make the existence the same as that thing, and then try to meditate on it, try to see, and then you will start to understand, like, oh, okay, like I can see how existence can be the same thing as that, as I just did with power. And it's very enlightening, like for me at least. Each one of these things, it just brings up this new aspect of existence that I didn't know before. Like up to now, I say, okay, yes, something exists, something doesn't exist, but I really don't know what it's not really tangible for me. But after I exercising it with these attributes, I start to realize, appreciate the act of existence in a much more tangible way. But it's still, we have to also be careful that, again, when we say that God is power, the same way that the existence that God is not the same existence, exactly the same existence as the existence of this camera. The power that God is not the same kind, is analogous, but it's not exactly the same thing as the power of this camera. So we have to be careful that we're still talking analogy here, but we're still talking about the same concept. All right, so that's it, I guess, for the first attribute. I hope in the next video I will go into maybe 1 or 2 more of these attributes, and yeah, we'll see. We'll take it from there.